Okay. Before we broach the GSV era, I wanted to go back to something about just your personality in general and ask if there were experiences or themes about in your kidhood that you feel like had far-reaching consequences for the person you are now, either the passions that you have or the interests that you have or the directions you went. It doesn't have to be a spiritual direction, but just something that connects you, the you of the present, with you as a kid. You can see yourself because of that experience or that relationship you had or some kind of semi-profound memory sticks with you.
Yeah, I think there's two pieces of that. My dad and I have about the same intelligence, but my dad only went to the 6th grade in school. And he was fairly unhappy. You know, he had moments of happiness in his life, but I'd say overall he hadn't created a life that I think he found as rich and as interesting as he'd hoped. And that had a profound effect on me. It's like, okay, that's the path I'm not going to go down.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, Dad and I wrestled about that some. You know, he didn't appreciate that I had to go. You know, I really felt the need to go to college. You know, and so that seeing what he did and trying to do it differently has really helped me to find a life that better suits me, that better suits who I am spiritually and intellectually. The second piece is my father was in combat when he was 15. He had taken his brother's birth certificate and stolen it and signed up for the army. And at that time, it was pretty easy to get in. He wound up in combat at 16 in Korea. And what happened for him, I think, is that he got very used to living in crisis, you know, to living in the moment that everything can go south at any moment. And so from a very early age, I remember him pulling me aside in many situations and saying, okay, here's what can go wrong in this moment. I mean, that's not how he said it, but that's what he meant, you know, that you should always be ready for a crisis. And so I tend to be a little hyperlogical, you know, in situations. But if there's a crisis, you need me in the room. You know, that I've been on the person on the scene of an accident many times, and you know, I can be really unemotional to get to the point where people are safer, and then I lose it. And so that's how I pretty much live my life, you know, which is, it's got its strengths and its weaknesses. You know, that if things really get dramatic and really crisis driven, I tend to get hyperlogical. I tend to get, okay, how do we get out of this? And it's not till later that the emotions come.
Interesting. Thank you. Okay. What was going on in your life when GSV crossed your path, or how did you find out about it is one way to talk about it, but also just what was going on? Where were you when this happened?
I was in Atlanta. This is shortly within 6 months of Chuck leaving to go to LA, and I was about ready to get my PhD, so I was in the last pieces of that. I still kind of was holding together, you know, 5 years of graduate work and writing my dissertation, but I was really depressed. I was really sad, and I wasn't moving out of it. And so I went to visit the First Existentialist Church in Atlanta, and I ran into Duncan T, who I'd known because he and Chuck were good friends. And we were both getting a cup of coffee, and he looked at me and he goes, "Well, how are you doing?" And I said, and the first time I really answered the question, I said, "I'm really not doing very well." And so he goes, "Okay." And he pulled out a piece of paper and he wrote down Franklin Abbott's phone number. He said, "Call this man, he will help you." And so I started going to therapy with Franklin, and I hated it. Well, I guess Franklin will know. I hated it at first. It didn't feel natural to me. It felt contrived. It felt, you know, whatever. But over a couple of years, it started to really work. And it must have been 2 years into therapy with Franklin. He said, "There's this men's conference that you might want to consider going to. It might be a little early for you, but you might want to consider going to that." And so I went.
Okay. And that was, had you finished your degree by then, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was after that goal had been accomplished, and you were what? Still living in Atlanta? You had a job then?
Yeah, I was at CDC.
And you weren't in a relationship though.
No.
Okay. Can you remember the decision-making process? Were you resistant to the idea, or did you just trust Franklin's advice?
No.
How did you decide to go to this thing?
Well, I think I was in a mode of starting to try things, and so I'd actually been going up to visit folks at a commune called Ida, which is near Short Mountain, and I was hanging out with them a lot, and I really liked them. You know, I really enjoyed being with them. I really liked the creative spark. I liked the energy. I liked the fact that that I wasn't the oddest one in the room.
How did you find out about Ida? Had you found out about them?
That's a great question. I don't know that I remember. It must have. I'm not sure I know how that transpired.
Okay.
But I was sort of trying to meet a lot of new people, meeting people that that were living more creatively. And so, but what happened for me with Ida was that the chaos around some of the drug use was a little too much for me. I didn't feel safe, and it wasn't that it was unsafe. It's just I didn't feel safe, and so and it was edgier than I could be. I think it was, coming from rural Kentucky to that. I certainly had a good time in there and thought about different ways of living. But I decided that it wasn't the way I wanted to. I didn't want to live with that much chaos, because I'd come from a very poor background where there was a fair amount of chaos, and I didn't want to go back to that. The best moment with the Ida folks was that they had come down for the Gay Pride March, and I was helping them, and we were late, and they had built a 2-story tall puppet that was welded to and onto shopping carts, which I assume were stolen. I don't know, and so we're coming in from the side. We had pulled this thing off of a truck, and we were coming in from the side, assembled it, and pulling him into the side because we were 45 minutes late, and we were coming into the side so we could catch the parade. And we come up to these police barricades with all these policemen standing there, and we pick up the barricades and start moving them. And the police are like, "Well, you can't do that." And I remember one of the fairies looked at me and said, "They don't know us very well, do they?"
Oh gosh. Okay, so did Franklin only vaguely describe this thing, or did he describe certain things about this conference
that was pretty
appealed
vague
to you?
Yeah. I think
okay.
It was fairly vague. Franklin was, over a period of years, starting to talk about, in a weird way, I think he was trying to tell me that I would never have trouble being logical, but I would have trouble breaking through that to being, living a fully enriched life. And so he at one point, I remember him saying, therapy's not going to be enough for you. You've got to find a spiritual path to add to the health that you're creating around therapy. And that started to make sense to me. That started to, and so that's something that really changed my life. If you talk about someone who changed my life, Franklin Abbott is probably the dominant male figure in my life.
So were you still in therapy when you went to your first conference?
I was, yeah.
Okay. And he was there?
No, he wasn't there. I think if he was there, he's gone off and on with conferences I've been at, but he stays fairly low key because I think some of his patients have gone there.
Right. So when was your first GSV? Do you remember what year it was?
Oh Lord!
Or which conference it was? Was it in the first 10 or the first?
It was certainly in the first 10. It was in the 90s.
Okay.
Somewhere in the mid 90s.
All right.
Yeah, it was somewhere in the mid 90s. Can I tell you a story about arriving?
Sure. That's the next question.
Okay.
Please do.
So,
Did you go with anyone?
No, I drove by myself.
Okay.
And I got there, and I drove up, and I remember seeing a guy walking across, Cassandra. I saw Cassandra in a dress, walking with long dangly earrings, walking down the path. And I'd been around fairies and stuff, but I was still very, fearful.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to back up my car. I literally put it in reverse and was going to turn back into the parking spot and turn around and go back out and just go back home. And John Stowe comes running up to my car, and I roll down the window, and he goes, "You're new. I'm so glad you're here." And he was so energetic and so excited. I was like, "Oh, I have to stay now." And so, he helped me, find the registration, and he stayed with me, right? And so, and he was so positive and so sunny. John was such a force of positive energy. And so we walked up to the registration table, and I signed in and whatever, and they had the little name tag thing, and at that time they were writing whatever it was on there for you. And I said, "Well, what do you want to be called?" And I looked at John like, because I didn't know the rules. I was like, "Okay, tell me the rules," because at Ida, everyone had fairy names and whatever. And John looked at me and says, he grabs me in my heart and he goes, "What are you feeling? What are you feeling?" And I said, "Panic." So they wrote down panic. So for several years, I was known as Panic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So now I see where this came from.
Yeah.
This other name. Okay. So what else do you remember about that day, or how it went from there? Were you handed off to others, or did you?
I was mostly terrified, but then I remember, I think we had workshops that night at that point. It may have been that night or the next morning. I went to a workshop with John Stowe about body work, and particularly about breathing.
Mm-hmm.
And there was some magic, that my body just started unfolding, and just, some source of power just started coming up, and it was wonderful. It was addicting. It was, and I just needed that, and I really needed that moment. And John Stowe was really good with body work, and he was also very physical. So whenever you saw him, he would find some way to touch you that was not erotic, but it was,
Mm-hmm.
amazing. Yeah.
Well, what was the spiritual backdrop of your introduction to GSV stuff? You said something about Southern Baptist, or?
Yeah, I was very Southern Baptist. Yeah.
Okay. And so between being raised in a church environment to the first conference, what was in between that? Did you early on forget the Baptist stuff? Did you explore any other spiritually things before the GSV era?
I think I was looking for. I studied a lot of Eastern religions, studied a lot of Buddhism, did a lot of meditation. I was sort of a wanderer. I was kind of, and may still be a wanderer in some ways. I went to some Pentecostal churches as I was growing up, and what I liked about the Pentecostal churches was the mysticism and the emotional piece were still present. I found like even in the Baptist churches, everything was very heady, and I didn't need that. I needed something to open my heart and open my soul. I didn't, and so in a lot of ways, GSV did big chunks of that for me, because it was much more about body work. It was much more about sort of being open to mysticism, being open to the idea of magic.
Mm-hmm.
Creating that personal miracle for yourself, whatever that is.
Okay. Do you remember anything in particular about that first conference as opposed to other ones that you went to?
I remember being incredibly nervous at the Heart Circle. I remember the hugs. I remember being held a lot.
Mm-hmm. Was the nervousness about, here come the stick is getting closer to me?
Yeah, what am I supposed to say? Yeah. what will be meaningful, what will be poignant. It was hard to get out of my head around it.
Do you feel like
I remember not getting much sleep. I remember sitting up and talking until all hours.
All right. Were you in a cabin or at the lodge? Or
I was in a cabin, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you had not met these people before?
No.
You didn't know anyone at the conference before you got there?
No.
Okay. And your experiences at Ida probably inoculated you to some of what went on there, or was what happened at the GSV rituals and all that stuff, was that totally new, or just semi-new?
It was all new. I liked a little bit of the structure. I mean, I liked having a little of that structure, and that, there were some ground rules about about how we're going to interact with each other. I liked that. That felt safer to me.
What about whatever ritualistic things that were going on, the fire pits or the direction-y things or the Native American doo-wahs or whatever was prevailing whenever you got there?
Yeah.
Was that not alienating, or was it interesting, or did you react to it at all? Do you remember?
I tended to be reductionist, so I was mostly focused on the idea of being present. And I liked that we were all working hard to be present.
Okay.
I like that a
lot. So I don't want to characterize this for you. I want you to do that. But did you feel like the anxiety eventually got swamped by whatever good feelings you were getting there?
I think it was just sleep deprivation. I was too tired.
Do you remember what it felt like to leave?
I was sad. Yeah. I was sad to leave. I was ready to get some sleep, but.
Oh, okay.
I felt like it was a safe, loving space. I think the boundaries that they set made it safe for me, and I think that I felt genuine connection, and I felt like I found part of my path. I found part of my spiritual path. A place where it wasn't a church, it wasn't, solitary meditation. It was something in between.
Okay.
And at that time, GSV was a little different than it is today, in that a lot of us were dealing with either having HIV or helping folks who'd had HIV, and so and most of us had. It's different than today in that most of the folks had never been married to a woman. I mean, most of the folks were out gay men who came out, in the 70s and 80s, and so it was a band of folks who had common experience and sort of common grief, and we're trying to figure out what to do with that. That religion wasn't giving us, the churches weren't really most churches did not have a place for us, but we had huge spiritual need because so many people were crossing over, and GSV sort of, I think, filled that spot for a lot of us.
Okay. Do you have any memories of what you expected as you were driving to the conference, what it would be like versus what it turned out to be?
I thought there'd be a lot more sex, but
okay, well, that's important to know. That's important to note. You thought there would be a lot more sex than there was.
Yeah.
Than there turned out to be. Okay.
It made me a little nervous because I assumed it was a much more sexually open environment than it was, which actually was a relief overall.
Okay, what?
It just sounded like a prude, doesn't it?
No. I want to know about some of your favorite memories of stuff that happened at conferences. It doesn't have to be the first one, just generalized. What were some of your favorite moments? If you had any.
We had a fire circle once on a Saturday night, and it was dark. And back then, there was a fair amount of unstructured time, that we'd have workshops and stuff, but then we'd have unstructured time. And a bunch of folks had wound up around the fire circle, so we were all sitting out there talking. And King Thaxton comes out of the woods, and he's wearing a completely green outfit with
Leaves.
with green LEDs woven into it up and down his entire body, and he walks around and stays in character as Green Man. And it's just one of those moments that, you know, I still get chills thinking about that. It just happened. It wasn't explained. We didn't have to create a context for it. We didn't have to talk about it. Everyone just went silent. And King danced around for a while, and, you know, did a lot of sort of modern dance for a while, and then he went back into the woods. And to this day, he would never say it was him, but we, you know, I know it was him. And that was good. The other time, there's been a couple sort of places where I thought that things happened semi-organically, you know, like somebody sparked something and then it went off into whatever it was. And there was a guy named David Serrata, who's a singer from Canada, and he had lost his lover, and he'd written a song which has now been, you know, recorded and on an album called Powerful Love.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point in the heart circle, he stood up and started singing that. And then we all, sorry.
Right. Forgotten about that.
And then we all started joining in once we figured out the lyrics.
About the keynote speakers that
Mm-hmm.
you've been to, how many conferences do you think you attended? And was it every year, every couple of years?
Well,
how did you decide to go or not go?
Well, at first I would go to the fall conference for a period of years, and then I switched over later to going mostly to the winter meditation because I just wanted something a little more peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for something a little more contemplative.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, we had a really good toilet paper fashion show at one of the meditation retreats. I'll never forget Matt coming up with this toilet paper design and coming in, and us all having our flashlights and a runway. You know, we had a toilet. You could wear whatever you want, but it had to be made out of toilet paper. So they wondered why that Sunday they didn't have no toilet paper in any of the buildings.
Oh, okay. So keynote speakers.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So you mentioned Malcolm Boyd. Did you? You had read the book long before you
Mm-hmm.
met him or he came,
Mm-hmm.
so I assume you were excited about that.
Mm-hmm.
And what was it like to meet him?
It was
Or
great.
be around
Yeah,
him?
it was great. He at the time he was quite old. I guess he was in his 80s. But you know, he still got around well. He was still mentally alert.
Mhm.
He was very kind. You know, it's funny that one of the keynote speakers I remember is because he didn't come, and that was Tom Spanbauer. But what happened was Chaser and Shauna Please and several other folks told their stories. And, you know, because without the keynote, it was going to be about stories, about personal stories and how to tell your stories. And so I think 4 or 6 people over the weekend told their personal stories. And it was, Shauna Please talked about, you know, I remember a line that he said, "These are not women's clothes, these are my clothes." Because he came from rural Georgia. I mean, he came from, you know, sort of the similar background that I came from. And he wore a lot of women's clothes, and he didn't consider himself cross-dressing. He considered himself wearing his clothes.
Mm-hmm.
And then Chaser told the story, and I completely got fooled by it at first. He told the story about his mom catching him having sex with one of his friends when he was, you know, 9, and then sending him off to a special school for gay boys where Walt Whitman was speaking, and, you know, James Baldwin came and gave a present, you know. And it was all this, what if we honored young gay boys with letting them know their heritage? And that was so powerful.
Wow.
Yeah. I wish we had a transcript of that. I mean, I think that story, I mean, he did it, I think he did it both to be funny, but also to be, what if we honored
Mm-hmm.
young gay boys with a real education about where they came from and who else is like them? That's powerful.
Okay. Did any other keynotes you want to talk about being particularly wonderful?
Yeah, I've never been into the keynotes. I've always seen the piece that I get out of it as more organic and
Mhm.
more collegial.
Very interesting. Okay. How about some of the non-keynote people, just people you met through GSV conferences who astonished you or helped you or gave you a new window into how you could be?
Well, number one is John Stowe. I mean, besides Franklin, but Franklin before that, but John Stowe. John Stowe was so into body work, and he was so. He was a scientist too. He was trained as a biologist, and so it's interesting. We had the same intellectual history, but he had this ability to pull you out of your head and get you into your body.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in many situations, he's the one that really started, let's take a breath together, brothers, or let's get out of our chairs and shake your butt. I mean, he'd get us moving in places where we were, were heading into that really heady space, and he'd pull us back. And he did it, so positively and so charmingly. And then I did some body work with John. I used to go for a massage, and he did all these oils. He'd come up with oil with whatever scents and stuff, and it was just wonderful. It was wonderful to get out of your heart. And the other thing, he would walk up to you, and if you felt like that you had something you were really thinking about, he'd walk up to you and he'd go, "What's going on right here? What's this? What's and he'd do that motion, and it was such a trigger for a lot of us to go, oh, wait a minute, I'm in my head. Okay, wait a minute, let's go to the heart and see what the heart says." And John was so powerful about moving that consciousness around between your head, your heart, and your body. And he was just so comfortable in his body. It was amazing. The other one that I can think of is King. Because King was so much about connection to the planet, and actually part of the research I do now around trying to connect people on the planet is based on spiritual ideas that I learned from King. That I have lots of scientific publications and stuff, but the root of it, what am I trying to do, comes from King.
Well, tell me more about that. I don't understand.
So King basically was trying to get to do mystical work about connection to the planet. I remember once he did a meditative workshop about breathing. It was about breathing the toxins out of the earth and away. And it was a little complicated. I'm not sure I can remember it exactly, but it was a really powerful visualization about what we do to the planet, we do to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that had a profound effect on me. It had a profound effect on the way I see us living on this planet, that when you throw something away, there is no away. When I, in fact, took a little bit of your blood, I could analyze 600 or 700 compounds that weren't known before 1950, and we don't know what that means. We honestly don't know that the results of that experiment. And so I've spent the last 20, 30 years of my life trying to figure out what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that comes from, and that connects really well with what King was trying to do around symbology and mysticism and meditation, around being his essence, which he saw as Green Man.
Mm-hmm. I did not know that about King.
Yeah.
Interesting. The small group experiences, were they powerful for you, or did y'all have them when you went? They have them in the spring as well, or the winter, or whatever.
It was in the fall. We didn't have them in the winter when I was going originally. The winter was much less structured. The winter originally, the first winter conference was supposed to be a silent retreat. Well, that lasted very long. You get a bunch of gay men together, we're not going to be silent. It's just not going to happen. And luckily we didn't have like the enforcer police or anything. I mean, people gave up right away and said, "Oh, it's not going to work."
Uh-huh.
The small group experience used to be a little more freeform than it is now. It was more about creating a space for you to process what you were going through. It wasn't like the whole gift thing is fairly recent, or at least it didn't start. The small groups didn't start with us giving gifts to each other. That wasn't really part of what that evolved.
Were you glad to be part of a small group, or was it powerful for you as well?
Depending on who was leading it,
Uh-huh.
It's been a mixed bag over the years.
Really?
Depends on who was leading it and how really present they were.
Uh-huh.
There have been a few folks that led the small groups that I've been in that just were struggling to be present themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then over the last few years, we've had. I've been in several small groups. I've been in more than one small group where someone was having a crisis around primarily recovery, and in one of the groups, no one was ready to deal with it, and we just kind of felt our way through it. But I've actually advocated for us being more intentional about that, because if that's who's coming now that we've got to be ready to catch folks who are going to go into crisis of one sort or another, and that we could be a little more intentional about that.
Okay.
Sorry, it's probably more than you want.
You may have already answered this, but are there times when you felt uncomfortable at a conference? And what created that discomfort? Other than your basic personalities being in your head, if that's what you said you were, what was your default mode?
Yeah.
I guess, but somehow you've gotten more comfortable with that, so maybe that's not an issue anymore.
Yeah, well, we all get old, don't we?
Yeah.
Franklin always said that when you're 50, when you're in your 50s, a lot of your issues get easier to deal with because you just don't feel like you don't have the energy to deal with them anymore. I think the discomfort for me has always been around expectations around sexuality, and most of those are self-placed. In other words, they're demons I create, not demons that exist. I think people have always been very good about creating space for people with very different expectations around sexuality. I've never really had sex at the conference. I mean, that's not why I've gone. And there have certainly been conferences where I wish it had happened. But
are you talking about the huge amount of mixed signals or easy to confuse signals that happen there, or are you talking about people coming there with agendas, or how do you mean that it's been
all of that? Yeah, I think that's all of that. I think the other thing is that some of the workshops around sexuality have been chances for me to push my boundaries a bit and figure out, okay, where am I with that? And question where I am around that, and that's been helpful.
Okay. But sometimes uncomfortable as you're doing it, as you're pushing it.
Well, let's go there. When I first broke up with Brian, I was going back to the conference, and I really just needed physicality. I didn't want sex. And at least one person really confused that and had a lot of trouble respecting my boundaries. And so, and maybe that's just the nature of the place and of being a man, is that, once you become intimate, like you cuddle, I think some folks believe that has to go on to sexuality. I was, so there's been, there have been times where that's been a little bit of an issue, is how do you tease apart what you need and be clear about it, and then also try to figure out what the other person's expectations are. And, I don't know that I've ever understood any of that language very well.
Okay. How does this organization seem different from other ones that you've been involved with? Whether it's the gay volleyball.
Are you gonna ask?
Era?
Are you gonna? I need a clarifying question
Sure.
here, and that is, are you going to ask about how it's changed over time?
Well,
Later.
eventually.
All right.
This is just comparing, sitting them beside each other and talking about how the processes are different. How you feel when you're with the gay volleyball people, say, there's probably other gay organizations you've been a part of that have been important to you. And then this one, how does it?
There's some similarities. I mean, I think that we all look for brotherhood. I think we all look for a tribe. You know, that's let's start with the similarities. Similarities are, you know, the physicality, the camaraderie, the silliness, you know, for me in gay volleyball, it was just the expending that energy that has to come out of your body in a way that is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in GSV you have all of those things as well, and then I think you also have more of a focus on being present and more of an openness to seeing and appreciating the vulnerability and the creative differences in people. You know, and with volleyball, it was more all of us being part of the tribe and everyone, you know, sort of branding themselves as a part of a tribe.
Mm-hmm.
With GSV, it seems to be more about, you know, Franklin, he says this and it always drives me crazy, but he says that your greatest strength is in your vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably what makes GSV different.
Okay.
Especially in a you know, as men, we're taught to be strong. You know, we're taught by society and expected to be strong. In GSV, in a weird way, we're taught that our power comes from our vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense to me. That's the way I would say it too. Something about vulnerability is real absent from the values of many gay groups. It's much more competition. Let's see how. Are there things that you have gotten through GSV that you know for sure you have incorporated into your life that you might not have if you had not stumbled across them there? Are there things that you've pulled in as part of your daily way of look at things? Well, what are those ways or things or methods or habits?
I think self-realization, you know, sort of is the foundation of that, right? To actually be conscious and present with who you are, and then try to manage that in the world that we live in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, handling my own anxiety is something that has been a full-time job in a lot of ways. And GSV's given me a lot of tools, and Franklin's given me a lot of tools. It's funny that sometimes I actually hear specific voices in my head. I hear John Stowe's voice in my head sometimes.
Uh-huh.
I'm like, just breathe, John, just breathe.
Uh-huh.
And with Franklin, I'll hear, I hear him at different times say something, you know, when I'm really stressed about something, or so yeah. I mean, I think the weird part is I have sort of a council of elders that runs around in my head every once in a while. I was just waiting for that moment where they need to say something.
Interesting. Okay, this is the question about how you feel the conferences have changed since you started. What evolution, devolution you see or have felt as you've gone along? Unless it's just stayed the same, it's some kind of...
No, I think it's changed a lot. I think that we've gone from a community in grief, dealing with lots of, you know, the impact of HIV, and trying to figure out how to, you know, sort of how do we watch people pass in a celebration in a positive way,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we heal those losses and carry them and honor them. To now, I think that the community seems to have evolved. That a lot of folks that are coming out later, have been married to a woman, feel safer now to come out as gay men, but it's a different set of needs. It's a different set of issues. There also seems to be and maybe it was always this way, but there seems to be a bigger emphasis on folks in recovery now within the organization, and so it's really evolved based on the needs of the folks that are coming, which I think is a positive thing, but it's a very different organization in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Back to a totally different subject that I asked about before. Is there any? Are there any lines going from your experience with GSV and the way you're parenting your child?
Oh, that's a good question.
If you had never gotten to GSV, would you be raising your child differently, do you think, or pretty much?
I think I'm much more present as a parent. I'm also, my son wrestles with attention issues.
Uh-huh.
And it's interesting that a lot of kids like that are very sensory based. And so for him, to get him in his body, to find things that let him get in his body really empowers him.
Mm-hmm.
And really he settles down, he's calmer, he's happier. And that is, sort of derivative of what I've learned from John Stowe. How do you get in your body? Well, you got to breathe, you got to do something sensory, and for him it's swimming. And so, I'm constantly looking for things to enrich his life that help him based on how I understand what I've learned from John Stowe and Franklin Abbott and all of those men. Mm-hmm. He went with me. On Tuesday nights I go to men's dance here, which I see in some weird way as part of GSV. I know it's not, but it sort of is consistent with everything I've learned in GSV. I took him one night with me, my son, and he wouldn't dance, but we sat in the corner and he watched, and he was just rapt attention. Because I wanted to, part of raising a child in a society is to let them see you completely as they grow up, and I'm still working on that. Still working on what that looks like.
Do you feel like GSV is abstractly or concretely supportive of whatever you're trying to do spiritually with yourself now? And just talk about that a little bit. Is it more of an abstract support, or is it more than abstract?
I don't know where I am with that question right now. I don't know. I think I'm, I really enjoy going. I enjoy seeing everyone. It feels a little bit more like a reunion weekend for me now, rather than a processing weekend, sort of. And maybe it's just where I am in my life, where I feel a little more settled in who I am. But I don't feel like I have, I don't feel like I have those huge chunks of personal growth work to do anymore. I feel like I have things I'm working on, but I don't, it's a different sort of thing. And I think a lot of us, I've talked to several other folks like me who've been around as long as I have, and we are wrestling. Several of us have said to each other that we're wrestling with what is the role of GSV in our lives now. Mm-hmm. It's fun. It's a great weekend, and I love seeing everyone. I get a lot. I still enjoy it. But two things. One is the organization's changed quite a bit, and that there's a different set of folks coming with a different set of needs, and you want to respect and honor that. And I don't feel like I have those big chunks of things I really need to. You know what I mean? I feel like that. Pretty in my body, doing pretty well. It certainly is renewing, but it's not as transformative as what. Maybe that's what it needs to be for me. Okay.
Have you ever recommended GSV to somebody else, or
yes?
And do you remember what you said to them to try to get them hopefully to get the most out of it.
Yeah, I just said it to my ex-partner, and he started going. I feel like it's really good for folks who aren't comfortable in other gay venues
Mm-hmm.
and who are carrying around some amount of internalized homophobia,
Mm-hmm.
and or who are having trouble finding a kind of spiritual path. I think those are all places where that's really freeing for a lot of folks. I think it works best if you're doing other work outside of that, but I think that it's certainly.
And how have you, or how would you, what advice would you give them to getting ready to go, or what to expect? How do you characterize it for them when you're saying this would be probably good for you, or why don't you try that? Or maybe you're not very concrete. You just say, "I think this would be neat if you try something."
I think I'm trying to remember. I think I'm not very concrete because I don't want to bias their experience, and I don't. In some ways, I think for the magic to happen, I think they have to walk in fairly open. I think that they have to go when they're ready.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I don't try to twist arms, and I don't try to. I mean, if they ask specific questions, I'll answer them. But with a couple folks that I've recommended to, I've had to reassure them that they don't have to do anything they don't want to do. That there are many things that happen at the conference that I don't participate in because it's just not right for me.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there's anything wrong with it, and so a lot of the folks who are at that point of trying to figure out how to have a healthier life as a gay person, as a gay man, need some reassurance that they can walk in slowly.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You were part of the planning regime at one point.
Right.
So, talk a little bit about what that was like, and in any respect that you want to, whether it was positive, negative, draining, exhausting.
I was part of the, I'm not sure what we called it at the time, but now I guess it would be the Council of Elders. And at that time it was elected. It was a little different format than we have now.
Uh-huh.
And I was brought in.
Was it after several conferences? Or
yeah.
Right after the first one?
No, it was several conferences in.
Uh-huh.
And I was elected, and a couple other folks. And there were three of us that came in sort of together, and that we really thought the organization had grown to the point where it needed to have a little bit more of a governing structure,
Mm-hmm.
that we needed some checks and balances in the financial system, that there were big chunks of money moving around quickly, and I don't think any of us thought there was anything wrong, although that later someone got really upset about that we were trying to accuse them of something, and I wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
But we're trying to create a little more formal procedures around how we make decisions, how we handle money, and that kind of thing, because the organization had grown quite big.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a bit of a splintering at that point where the person in charge, who I don't want to name, who was sort of head of the council, got really offended. He'd been on the council for several years, got really offended that we were somehow casting doubt on his leadership when all we were saying was we'd like to create some process. That's what happens when organizations, nonprofits get this big.
Mm-hmm.
And the three of us had experience in management in different organizations and different nonprofits, so we were just bringing our knowledge to the organization, and it was pretty bad. It was really bad in that the folks that had been there a long time took everything very personally, and it was very hard to have a positive conversation. We used to meet at the Friends Meeting house over on McClendon, DeKalb. And I remember one meeting where people just got up and stormed out. I was like,
wow, I didn't know it had come to that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so I dropped out of the organization for a few years after that because it was so painful. It was just painful to go through that.
Mm-hmm.
That people of good intention often come at heads.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was learning for me. I learned a lot about, how not to do it if you're trying to promote positive change. One of the three of us was quite headstrong and wasn't necessarily the most diplomatic. And so...
But you're not saying that you were mistaken in your idea about what the organization needed?
No, I think we needed the checks and balances.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. The other thing was that there was the other part of that splintering was hard. Was that we were trying to create a feedback system where we would have someone set up and lead, like the fall conference. And then we would sit down and debrief about what went well and what needed to change. And we'd never done that as an organization. And so the first time we did that, we all sat down to sort of debrief. And that turned into this, once again, this horrible deconstruction of the organization that people couldn't hear any kind of negative or criticism. There was no ability to really critique what had happened in a positive way. And it may be the nature of his organization. I just wonder if the nature of the organization is it's so tender, that we're all so tender and vulnerable in that space, that we really can't go to that critique space. That we can't go to that space where we say something needs to be improved. That's a hard one. That was a hard time.
So. If there's anything you can say about the processes that were used to plan conferences or to have meetings or whatever, I guess I'm still kind of reeling from the people storming out. I mean, that's not supposed to be an option. But so I'm just curious as to what you remember of how you went about planning a conference and how. That may be too broad of a question to ask, but
it was a little more chaotic than it is now. I mean, there was one person who was sort of, would take responsibility as the convener, and then they would put together a small group around them to create, sort of the conference. And depending on who that group was, it had a very, each conference had a very different flavor and a different emphasis. And it was very personality driven, and depending on the person and their personality, it could be a very different experience.
Was that also true of the meetings to plan the conference? Was it real different based on who was facilitating the meetings?
Yeah, right, yeah. I mean, some people sort of did it on their own, and then sort of some people did it with 3 or 5 of their friends, and going back to the criticism piece, I want to throw in one thing that was that during one of those sort of evaluation pieces, the person who was the convener, I said something, and I probably didn't say it the most diplomatic that I could have, about that we needed to improve this piece of the conference. And that person sent me a message and said, "Next time I see you, I'm going to punch you in the face." And I was like, okay, wow, okay. That didn't go so well. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, there's a list of people on this piece of paper of people who are not alive anymore. And the most interesting way we've gotten feedback before is just for you to go down the list. And if you remember a story about them or can paint a little picture of your impression of them, that might help us to eventually construct a little word picture of this person we can't interview. So we'll see how that goes. And it's in alphabetical order, so you don't have to go that way, but that is one way to go, is just down the list till somebody triggers a memory.
Shauna, please. Yeah, Shauna was so beautiful. So sweet. Yeah, I told you the piece about these are my clothes.
So talk a little bit about this person. I did not know Shauna that well, so I'm going to be an example of a person who I'd like to hear more about what she was like or he was like, since I didn't know her much. What was this person? Who was the person?
Shauna was sort of in many ways, physically a chameleon. He would move back and forth, with different styles of dress, and look great in everything.
Mm-hmm.
Very soft-spoken, but very powerful, very confident in who he was. He and Craig Lee were married.
Mm-hmm.
He had 2 children, I believe. He was married to a woman previously. Just really powerful. Just a really powerful, understated person. When he spoke, people stopped and listened.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very kind. Martin, Tree Walker. Martin and I were friends. I knew Martin when he first came to GSV. I believe he and I came about the same time. And Martin was a piece of work now. It's funny that I knew him early on and then I knew him later because I took that break in between. And later he was almost venerated in the organization. And it was really interesting to see him being venerated and knowing him for so long, and because we both came in and we were both kind of messes, when we first came to the organization. It was interesting to see him sort of claim his power and people like giving him power within the organization. It was really interesting to see that evolution.
Mm-hmm.
I had to kind of giggle to myself every once in a while that everyone was taking him so seriously. I'm like, wow, we used to be a lot sillier than this. I don't know. Ramon Noya. Ramon was a lighting expert and lived near me over by Emory. Beautiful man. He had mocha skin. He had a very soft voice. Very kind, very loving. A little bit standoffish, a little bit, he held a little bit back. You could always tell he was, a little bit, to himself. Oh, Cassandra. Good Cassandra. Cassandra actually was an atmospheric scientist working here in Nashville for the federal government. Got in all kinds of trouble there. I don't know the details, but had a lot of trouble with them. The GSV was really important to Cassandra. It was almost like he had to pack in all of his loving in that weekend. That he was fairly isolated, as far as I can understand. He was fairly isolated. He was an introvert, didn't really tend to keep to himself. But that weekend, he read his poetry. He was, really just. He was trying to find ways to tell everyone how much he loved them. I remember one year I came to the conference and I drove up the mountain and all the trees were little red hearts. They were about this big. And they had been hung, hundreds of them in every tree. And Cassandra was trying to tell everyone how much he loved them. So he was kind of always doing things like that. And he was awkward. He was socially really awkward. It was hard for him to be with people. Mm-hmm. He did a lot of writing and trying to tell people, sort of how he loved them through his poetry, or how he loved them through his performance, or through, the silly acts of leaving hearts everywhere. Such an interesting man. Let's see, John Stowe we've already talked about. King Daxton we've talked about. David Witt. What a sweet man. Tall, black hair. Very kind, very loving.
Older, middle-aged, younger?
Older, yeah.
Older.
a little bit older. Yeah, he was a leader of one of my early small groups, and I was fairly uncomfortable when I first couple times I went to the conference, and he was very good about checking in with me and holding me. Just he'd just grab me and give me this big huge bear hug and hold me. Even if I didn't want to be, and, even if I struggled a little bit, and he was like, "No, I'm going to hold you for a little bit. You're going to be all right." Yeah. Yeah, he knew what I needed in a lot of ways better than I did at that time. David was really sweet that way. I'm amazed the number of people I don't know. Leon Lashner. Leon really believed in like big energy work. Like that it was possible to create an energy field around yourself that was big enough to love everyone, but that it took a lot of practice to get there. And he gave this workshop once on creating these energy fields around yourself. And I remember him talking about that. And I, being the scientist, was like, and I asked him a question about, it's possible to generate a field of love around yourself that makes everyone around you feel loved and better. And he was so adamant about that being possible that you could almost see it around him. You know what I mean? I mean, he was so sure that existed, and that's how he lived his life. That I believe if you ask everyone in the room, that we all thought we saw it for a moment. Yeah, he was a powerful, powerful man. Yeah. It's funny, I probably know most of these freaks by face, but I don't know. I never knew Raven. I've certainly feel like I know him secondhand.
Okay. Well, what did you think we might cover that you would like covered that we did not touch upon? Because we want to be sure you get in your GSV stuff. If there's a ball of wax we didn't get close to, or...
Well, I want to tell a little bit of the story, but I also I want to talk about fairy names for a moment.
Okay.
Because I think it's interesting that in our tribe, some folks feel the need to have a different name, and I think that may have grown out of the fact that some folks didn't want to be known that they were there early on, but I think that now it's sort of an accepting part of your identity that that either you're wrestling with or that that you are going to accept. And now it's that if you want a fairy name, then you say what you want, and then everyone around you chants it 3 times. I think it was more organic.
Really? I didn't know it was bestowed in such a formal way.
Well, I think that's the new radical fairy way of doing it.
Oh.
Well, my name went from Panic to Pan, and I think I may have told you this story. Have I told you this story?
Tell me the story.
Okay. So for several years I was known as Panic. And then, I didn't talk about Andrew Raymer. I need to talk about him. Andrew and I went on a hike. I was still known as Panic. And he and I were talking and laughing and whatever and walking around. And we were walking along, and there's a snake in the path. And I went over and grabbed it. And Andrew backs up, and it's like, whoa! And I said, it's just a garter snake. I said, isn't that cool? And he's like, and so I put it back down, put it in the weeds, and it slithers off. And Andrew's like frozen watching to see that it goes away. And he walks over and he goes, no more ick. And so that's how it became Pan.
Mm-hmm.
So it was this evolution, from being Panic to being, sort of claiming that connection to nature.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew Raymer has been quite a force within GSV, in that I think he's given us a lot of our symbology. I think he's helped us write the language around some of the things we were talking about. He's such an intellectual in that way. In many ways, he's a linguist. He actually helps us create the language we need around a lot of the symbols we were trying to create.
Mm-hmm.
I think John Stowe did some of that too, especially with Gay Spirit Warrior and some of that. It's interesting that there's this sort of intellectual side of this that's developed the language we needed to do the other work, because the books like Iron John and stuff, and Joseph Campbell's work and John Bly's work, all that stuff, I think was an interesting place for us to start, but it was really inadequate for where we were going. And I think people like Andrew Raymer and John Stowe and other folks have written really cohesive stuff that has brought that language to where we needed it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I give Andrew Raymer a lot of credit for the organization being as cohesive as it was and having the depth that we needed. So those two things I could think of that we didn't talk about.
Okay. Well, unless you have other things that come up in the next few moments, we're done.
Well, good. It's been an honor to do this.
It's been wonderful to hear some of it. You have brought up a lot of really interesting things that had not been brought up before. And I really am so glad we talked to you about it.